Okay, I'm unmuting everybody. And
It's 1 o'clock.
yeah, it's 1 o'clock. Can everybody hear me okay? No, that's not.
He said that he's gonna get it fixed.
That better? Can you hear me better now? I'm going for it. The good thing I'm tall.
Recording in progress.
Testing. Can everybody hear me now? Whoop. Feedback. Everybody on Zoom, if you would mute yourself, because we're getting feedback. Feedback. Can you mute? Is that better? No, it's not.
No, it's not.
It's me. Take.
Is everybody muted? Okay, testing, is that better? That's better. We were getting feedback because somebody on Zoom wasn't muted. Is that door bothering people? Because it's some nice air coming in. Do you want me to leave it open or close?
It's pretty glare. There's a one spot. It's really pretty bright for him. Let me close it down. See what happens. Down, isn't it? That's better. That's better. Yeah. Okay, at least I can leave it open a little. Yeah. Yeah, leave it open some.
Okay. Everybody else, I guess, is out enjoying the sunshine. That's okay.
People agree that those were the only branches of knowledge.
In the Renaissance, yes. At that time, they could fit most things into those areas. So this is where we stopped last time. Make sure I'm unmuted. Get my foot up here. There we go. Okay. So we had talked about the room and the space and the 4 walls, each of which have one of these subjects, but I wanted to look at one of the walls in more detail and talk about it because it gives you a much better idea of how all these walls work together and what they symbolized. So this is the wall that's known as the School of Athens, which is a reference to Socrates' school in Athens. It wasn't an actual building. It's a term that was used in the ancient world for all of the students of Socrates that followed him around and listened to him talk. So it's a term that's being used here to refer to this sort of idyllic scene of a large group of both Greek and Roman philosophers, but it also includes mathematicians and some scientists. Now, understand when they use the word philosophy, they didn't just mean what we think of as philosophy. They meant that word referring to sort of intellectuals in general. So fields like astronomy and mathematics were included because these were the intellectuals of their era. And they're all from the ancient world. They didn't all live at the same time. So it's an idyllic. It always reminded me of like Rock and Roll Heaven, right? Do you remember that song? Where like all the great musicians are in one place at one time. That's it. The great ancient philosophers are all together in one place at one time. So right away, it's sort of idyllic, but it also shows how important that intellectual foundation was during the Renaissance, or how strongly they believed it was the foundation of their own world. So let's look in general at what we've got and how he structured it, and then we'll take a look at some of the details, because the details are really interesting. First of all, we have this space that's created using Roman architectural design. That's Roman architecture. You recognize the arches that we saw in Roman architecture, but it's not any one actual place. It's ideal, an ideal building that frames all of these philosophers as they move back in space. It's symmetrical, it's beautifully symmetrical, or we have two figures in the center, and we'll talk about them in just a moment. Floy, if that's a problem, you can move over to somewhere else.
I think it's the flapping.
The flapping, did you, is it okay? Okay. So we have them grouped in a kind of foreground, sort of two levels of foreground, and they're broken down into smaller groups. So we have, let me see if I can find my laser pointer again. Laser pointer. We've got sort of a group over here, and we'll take a look at that group. We've got like a group up here, over here, over here. He's sort of using Leonardo's design. Remember how he grouped the figures in the Last Supper, where he had a group of three here and a group of three there, a way to make it feel natural, bringing together a lot of individuals. Now, he studied actually in Perugia with Perugino, was his teacher. And we looked at Perugino's delivery of the keys to St. Peter last time. And I talked about how that painting was a kind of summation of all of the techniques of the early Renaissance, using the one-point perspective and all of that. But we also talked about how awkward that scene was, because Perugino has this abrupt change between foreground, middle ground, background. He has these groupings, these instead of having sort of rational groupings, they're all sort of in line. What Raphael is doing is giving us a much more natural way of grouping figures and creating the space. And some people believe that when he designed this, he was very intentionally referencing his teacher's painting, and in a sense showing him up, you know, where his teacher was somewhat awkward, he's now using all these things, but he's doing it in a much better way, much more subtle in terms of the perspective and the groupings of people and the like. So maybe it was intentional, referencing his teacher and showing that he could do it better, maybe not, but he is doing it better. Now let's see who some of these people might be. In the middle, he shows us the two figures that are at the vanishing point, which is where our eye is drawn, and that is Plato on the left and Aristotle in blue on the right. And we know who they are because of, first of all, the books that they're carrying and also how they're gesturing. So you have Plato on the left, who's the older man, and he's holding his book, the Timao, and you can sort of see it. This is the book in which he talked about the ideal and his theories of the ideal, which is why he's pointing upward to the ideal, where Aristotle is holding his Nicomachean Ethics, which is where he's talking about, no, we should be focusing on the physical world, and he's gesturing down at the earth. So we have the sort of ideal and the real in their two gestures. Now, other things that are happening are sort of interesting. Down here, we have a reclining figure, assumed to be Diogenes. Anybody know who Diogenes was? A Greek philosopher, really interesting Greek philosopher. He was a cynic, the Cynicism movement, and cynics believed that basically they denied all sort of behavior that they thought was hypocritical, and that would be following any sort of social standards or rules. He rejected that because he thought that was just being hypocritical. And he used to just lay down on the ground and speak of his philosophy. He's an interesting person. A lot of people talk about Diogenes as sort of like the first performance artist. Because he sort of performed his philosophy, but just laying on the streets and talking, and people thought he was this old hermit. He's a really interesting person. And we think it's Diogenes, number one, because he's sprawled on the ground, but also there are characters around him that are kind of gesturing at him and like, what's this guy doing? I want to say something about the body that you see here. Diogenes was an old man, a hermit, and Raphael's painting him as if he is a muscular, buff strong person. Now he's doing that. In fact, there is evidence that he repainted this figure, that he had painted it one way and then came back and changed it after he saw other paintings that were going on in the Vatican, not far from him. Now remember, this is being painted in the Stanza della Segnatura, the room in the Vatican that was the private office of the Pope. At the same time, not that far away in the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo was painting the ceiling, and Raphael would stop in there quite regularly and look at Michelangelo's process. And we talked about those figures. We looked at Adam and saw the sort of muscular figures of Michelangelo. And when Raphael saw what he was doing, he went back and repainted several of the figures in his wall paintings in the stanza. And that's probably why Diogenes looks sort of muscular and Michelangesque, as we would call it, because he was watching what Michelangelo was doing. Now remember, Raphael is the great synthesizer. He's not a great inventor of new techniques, but he would take what Leonardo was doing, like the way he grouped figures, and he would take what Michelangelo was doing, like the way he painted the human form, and then he would sort of absorb those and make them part of his style. Now, this grouping over here on the far right is meant to be Euclid, the inventor of geometry, Euclidean geometry, a mathematician, and surrounded by his students, and he's drawing some diagrams there on a little board. But Raphael has painted the face of a contemporary architect on Euclid. So that's actually the face of Bramante, who was a contemporary of Raphael and an architect. So we have to think about, why did he do that? What statement is he making by putting this architect's face on a mathematician, and particularly a geometrician? So what he's doing is linking architecture with this intellectual form of mathematics. Now remember, we talked about the fact that poets get their own wall in this room, but the painters and sculptors and architects do not. So what Raphael's going to do is he's going to slip artists into this painting. He's basically saying architects are mathematicians. They're no longer stonemasons. I mean, that's, the whole concept of architect is a new idea in the Renaissance. Before this, builders were just builders. They weren't artists. They were the stonemasons that went out using manual labor and quarried stone and then piled it up and made a building. We've got this new thing called an architect, who's an intellectual, who designs buildings based on these intellectual ideals. They're not the ones that go out and build them anymore. They then hire people to build them, kind of like we do today, but it was a new idea in the Renaissance. And so he's trying to elevate this role of architect, and by equating it to an intellectual like a Euclid. And he does the same thing with Michelangelo. Down here in the front, we have a figure who's been identified as Heraclitus. Heraclitus is a brilliant philosopher. If you want to read more about the philosophy of the period, Heraclitus is a wonderful person you should read about. I won't go into his philosophy, but he did have a reputation as being a bit difficult to get along with, difficult to work with as an individual. And so he's painted the face of Michelangelo on Heraclitus, because Michelangelo had the same reputation. He was somewhat belligerent and not easy to get along with. And so we have his face now. So he's equating sort of the personality, the ideals of his own contemporaries with these ancient philosophers. The other thing is he's showing Heraclitus wearing stonecutters' boots. Those are not something the ancient Heraclitus would wear or even know about, but Michelangelo did, because as a sculptor, he would go out and quarry and choose his own stone, and these are the kind of boots he would wear. So that's another thing that ties this to Michelangelo. And does he get himself in the picture? Yes, he does. Way over on the far right, the gentleman there staring out at you is a self-portrait of Raphael, and you can see him pretty clearly. He would have been 27 or 28 years old at the time that he painted that. So you can see he's a very young man and how successful he was at that age. So that is Raphael, again, tying himself to all of the philosophers that you see in the picture. So overall, it's a big message. It's a powerful message about rationalism, rational and intellectual men in a harmonious and rational space, all comes together. So this really summarizes the Renaissance ideal, which is what the Pope wanted in his private rooms. The thing is, though, rationalism isn't everything. He's the Pope, and the other wall that deals with religion speaks about the other side. Rationalism and intellectualism is one side of the coin. Another wall in this same room is the spiritual side and is about the dominance of the church. So clearly they saw them as two sides, two bookends to life, to what the experience of life was, not as opposites, but as two complementary ideals: rationalism and intellectualism, and then theology and the spiritual realm all together to ground knowledge and human experience. Okay.
Did Raphael paint all four?
Yes, but he certainly would have had a lot of help. And I seriously doubt his hand painted it all. I believe that Michelangelo probably did do all of the final layer. I suspect Raphael didn't personally paint all of it. He would have had students, but he would have overseen everything. He would have gone in and made a change or a correction, if it wasn't exactly as he wanted. That was typical. So let's talk about Venice. So far, I've left Venice out of this little discussion of Italy, and I said we would talk about it separately because Venetian art is really very different. It has a whole different history, and it was a very different culture in many ways than the rest of Italy. So let's talk about Venice. Venice wasn't just the city of Venice we're familiar with today. It was a very, very large, technically it was a republic. In reality, they called it a republic. It was a little bit more like an empire. And at its height, as we'll see, it extended quite widely. But Venice had the largest and most powerful military force in all of this region, particularly the Navy. They were the bulwark against the spreading Ottoman Empire. And you can see the Ottoman Empire is spreading west and right on the verge of moving into Europe. They've already moved across North Africa, but right here, stopping them is the Venetian army. And there were constant war with the Ottoman Turks. And so their role is an important one. They were also huge maritime, both commercial force as well as military force. And it was the Navy was their power. So greatest commercial and military power. They were very, very wealthy. There were a lot of patrons, a lot of very secure patrons in Venice who wanted art. However, Venetian taste is different. Venice was quite removed from Rome, and therefore they didn't really answer quite as directly to the church as artists in Rome or in Florence did. There was a little bit of freedom, and Venetian taste develops to be quite different from anywhere else in Italy. They're going to prefer a much more sensual art, a much less intellectualizing in Venetian art. It's more romantic, it's more colorful, and they're also going to be the first to use some new materials. I'm separating Venetian art not only because it's different, but because it's the art of Venice that is looking toward the future. The next century is going to be influenced directly by the art of Venice, far more than it is those high Renaissance masters we just looked at. Raphael will come back into popularity later in the 18th and 19th century, but the 17th century is going to look right to the Venetians and some later Italians, but not Renaissance artists. So what am I talking about in new materials? Well, the new materials that the Venetians are bringing to art is the use of canvas. Now, we know that when oil painting entered Italy from Flanders, it entered through Venice. but they're the first ones to begin using canvas. All the other oil paintings, so far, everything in the Renaissance we have looked at is either a fresco or oil on wood, wooden panels. Now we're going to look at, for the first time, the use of canvas. And that's coming from Venice. And it's an interesting story as to how this got started and why it got started in Venice. It's not a coincidence that it begins in a culture that is a large seafaring culture. They had warehouses full of canvas that were used for sails on ships. That's where the canvas really came from. The other problem is that Venice is basically underwater. It's seafaring. Because of the city of Venice, you actually can't have frescoes in Venice. It's too wet. There's one real danger to frescoes, and that's water. If a wall gets water bound or soaked in water, it will destroy the fresco if the wall soaks up water. And you can't do a fresco. So what they started to do in Venice for wall painting was taking canvas. This is how it began, taking canvas and stretching it on a wall and then painting on the canvas. That's step one. And then the next step is to use the canvas and simply attach it to a wooden frame, the way artists have ever since then. So it began first by attaching it to a wall as a replacement for fresco technique. And then that moved into just canvas, on wooden frame. So it's an interesting story as to how and why it gets started. But canvas, the use of canvas will spread pretty quickly. And everyone will do that. And most artists, occasionally someone will paint on wooden panel, but they still do. But by and large, canvas will replace wooden panels. Now, the preparation of canvas for painting is different from how you would prepare wood. It's just a different material. And there's a little diagram here that shows the process. And this first generation using canvas is going to be experimenting in the same way they first experimented with oil in general. You have to sort of learn your materials, but you start with your wooden stretcher. And then on top of that, you put your canvas and then some sort of sizing material. There's a thin layer of what's called sizing, which is rabbit skin glue. They would put down a rabbit skin glue, and then on top of that would go the primer or the gesso. Now, today, artists just buy big tubs of gesso, and it has the material, and you don't have to do sizing anymore and then gesso. It's all sort of one thing that you just buy in a big tub. Now, the purpose of having to prepare or prime the canvas that way is to protect the canvas from the materials, the organic materials in oil paint. They would, if you just put oil paint on an unprimed canvas, it'll just eat right through the canvas. You have to put a layer down there in some way to protect that canvas. That's why later in the 20th century, when acrylic paints come along, you technically don't have to prepare. You can paint acrylics right on raw canvas if you want to, because it's inert material. It's basically just plastic. It's not going to damage the canvas. But with oil, you need to prime it. Then after you primed it with your gesso, you then put, and you're ready to paint, the first layer would be an imprimatura, and that is basically a solid color, and this changes over time. Before you start painting in your colors, you put down a single color as a starting point, and you don't put it down smoothly, but kind of roughly. That's basically to tampen down the white of the canvas. You don't want to paint on that pure white, at least they didn't want to. Some artists will later. But at this point, they didn't want to paint on the pure white of the canvas, so they would roughly put down maybe a beige color or a deep maroon. It depends what you're painting, but you lay down a deep color and then you paint on top of the color. Now, as centuries go on, we'll see later centuries they prefer painting on a white ground. It just depends on the painting style. And then your pigment goes on top of that. So it's a long process. Now, canvas is going to be different from wood because canvas has tooth, and tooth simply refers to the texture. Even when you put gesso on it, you're not going to polish it to a hard marble surface, marble-like surface, the way they did wood. It's still going to have a certain amount of texture, and that's important to the process of oil paint, because they're going to learn how to push oil paint around. They're going to stop painting in a linear style with tiny little brushes, and they're going to start using larger brushes, and they're going to start like pushing the paint around, and the paint will sort of catch in this tooth in an interesting way. So it's going to lead to new techniques, and those are going to develop in Venice as well. And then, of course, it's flexible. If it's on a wooden frame, it moves. So they had to come up with new kinds of gesso, new kinds of paint mixtures that aren't going to crack if they move a little bit. So they did come up with those new flexible materials. So all of that's beginning in Venice. Now, this is not on the list. I decided to add this. Sometimes I include it, sometimes I don't, but I decided I wanted to put some Giorgione in here because he gets overlooked far too often, and he's really important. He's one of the first. He may be, I'm going to certainly say he's one of the first artists to paint with oil on canvas. Whether it was the first, I don't know, but he was certainly one of them. The subject matter that is preferred in Venice is a very different one. They loved poetry, and particularly in painting, they loved poetic allegory rather than those intellectualized subjects that you saw in Rome or in Florence. And when I'm referring to poetic allegory, I mean, there's symbolism here, but it's inspired by poetry. And one big difference between poetry and simple narrative or prose is that poetry is often vague in terms of what it means. It's suggestive as opposed to a clear narrative. If you want a clear narrative with detail, just write a narrative. But if you want it to be, you want to create a mood, and you don't care that every detail is communicated, poetry is good for that. And I liked that vagueness of poetry. And that's going to come up again in art, where artists embrace poetry as a model. They're going to make art that is more suggestive and less clear. And so when you get something like this called The Tempest, people have spent a great deal of time talking about what this is about, and nobody knows. The simple fact is nobody knows. You can find a dozen people that are going to tell you what it's about, but I will guarantee that's just their point of view, that there are plenty of other people that have different points of view. So as a historian, it's my job to simply tell you there are many points of view and not take one of those, because I don't know any more than they do. It's poetic, it's suggestive. And personally, I like that kind of art. I'm personally more attracted to things that aren't, excuse me, aren't immediate and clear. I like things that are left open for me to think about. That's just me. Everybody's got different things they're attracted to. So what we do know is that we have, first of all, this landscape. And I want to talk about that because thus far, there is no such thing as landscape painting in Western art. And there won't be for a while. This is 16th century. It's going to be another 100 years before there's true landscape painting in Western art. And we'll talk about that history and how that happens. However, you do get in the 16th century paintings that begin to suggest that direction in which nature itself plays a very important role in the painting. And I don't think anybody could deny that this landscape, the sky, the storm, it's called The Tempest after all, that is what is most responsible in creating the mood of this painting. Nature is a wonderful thing in art. It can suggest every kind of emotion you can think of. You can suggest through nature, through weather alone, you can suggest moods. So this is the beginning of it. It's as if the land is sort of the third character, pardon me, fourth character, if you're going to count the baby. So what do we have? We have a woman nursing a child and a man on the left watching. Now he's been identified as a soldier. He's wearing His clothes identify him as a German mercenary. And there were lots of German soldiers, mercenary soldiers in the Venetian army. They had a huge army, and a large part of it was mercenaries, and many were German. So this would have been someone they would have seen in Venice. Now, other than that, I can't give you any more information. It's just this vague story. Now, it's very likely, this is a private commission. It's not real large, 33 inches by 29. It's very likely, I think, that whoever commissioned this had something in mind, knew what they meant by it. It meant something to them. The problem is we don't have that information now. So I doubt if it was as unknowable then as it is today. It probably would have had some meaning for that person, but we just don't know what it is. But I want to show it because of the technique, the looser handling of the paint, and the subject, which is leading us in a new direction. Both of these are leading us in a new direction. The most famous Venetian painter and a student of Giorgione's is Titian. Titian is certainly one of the great artists of the High Renaissance. This is Venetian Renaissance, Venetian High Renaissance, and he's certainly up there, I think, probably above all of the others we've seen so far, certainly more influential than any of the others that we've seen so far. He lived to a very old age. Now, Giorgione died fairly young. I think he was like 35 when he died, but Titian lived to be like 86. And when you have a long career like that, certainly we're going to know more about him. He's going to have a lot more works that we know. So we know more about Titian, but I think that's why it's unfair. We tend to focus on Titian and ignore Giorgione, but he was really the first, and he was the teacher of Titian. For a long time, I remember I first was studying this. First time I saw this painting, it was identified as being by Giorgione. For a very, very long time, this was by Giorgione. And then new editions of the textbook started changing, and they said it was by Giorgione/Titian, saying, well, Giorgione started this, but we think Titian finished it. And then at some point, someone made the decision, no, this is just Titian. So now we just identify as Titian. That's how things change. Scholars come along, there's a new papers written, new research, we rethink something. So it's been rethought, and now we identify it as just Titian. It's a really interesting painting that I'll come back to later. It's also set in an idyllic landscape. You know, the sky in Venetian paintings is always important. It's always sort of moody. It's always sort of powerful. It's bringing a kind of energy. It's not just some nondescript background as it had been before. And you certainly see this here. It's not as moody as the Tempest that we just saw, but nonetheless, there's a darkness to the clouds, and it's important. You know, in later paintings, we'll refer to things like a Venetian sky. That's what we mean. We mean the sky has a kind of energy to it, a presence to the sky, and that's from Venice. So let's see what we've got going on here. The pastoral concert. So we have three men, one way in the background, the shepherd, two men here, one who's clearly an aristocrat, and then the one next to him who is a servant of some kind, dressed very poorly, probably his servant. One man has a musical instrument, a lute of some kind, and then two, and they're wearing contemporary Venetian clothes of the time period, and then two nude or semi-nude women. Now, how are we to interpret this? Well, at the time, they wouldn't have known exactly how to interpret this. There would have been no question whatsoever. It's an allegory. They would have understood immediately that this isn't reality, that this isn't really two men out in the fields with two nude women, that those two nude women aren't really there. They're allegorical figures. And that's because they are classical figures. The nudity, the drapery that's fallen off identifies them and links them to the ancient classical world. So who might they be? Let's see if we can figure it out. He's playing a musical instrument. She's got a flute. She's pouring water into a well, a symbol you may not know, but that is actually a symbol of poetry. Water is a symbol of poetry, as is a well. The shepherd back here, can't tell what he's doing, but shepherds are actually also the symbols of poetry. So who might those women be? From Greek mythology, those of you that just took the mythology class, where did we see women who were associated with the arts? I'm going to start giving tests, okay? The Muses, remember the Muses? Yeah, remember the Muses? Well, there's only two here. They didn't all come, they weren't all invited, just a couple. We only needed a couple. So this is widely understood as an allegory of the arts, because we've got music and poetry, two high art forms. So an allegory of the arts, and they're just there inspiring the musician, inspiring him. Now, as strange as the scene looks today to people, it was perfectly understood at the time exactly who they were. There wasn't anything inappropriate about it. Now, I'm going to be bringing this painting back later when we look at work by a much later artist who himself is often inspired by earlier works. And we'll take a look at
Could that have been commissioned by someone?
Oh, it would have been,
Yeah,
definitely.
but, okay, I'm jumping ahead. The gentleman, the fine gentleman in the red suit, could he be the
He
commissioner,
could
I
be.
would say?
He could be, but it wouldn't have to be. Anyone would have been happy with a painting of an allegory of the arts. I mean, it was just, anyone could have had it. Yes,
Didn't you once say that this kind of thing was their pornography?
no, not this,
Not this, later, no.
no. Yeah, no, not this, but we're not too far away. I'm not gonna call it pornography, but there are elements of some of these nudes that have, not this painting, but I'll show you one in a minute, that has intentional erotic, not pornographic, but erotic elements to it. Yes, Ginger, did you have something? Anybody?
The
Yes.
shape of the painting seems like something's been cut off the side. You don't usually see one that looks square.
Almost, it's not quite square, and you're picking
I
up
know
on,
it isn't, but it looks that way, but
It's
they have it
closer.
higher than it is.
You're right.
It looks odd.
it does, you're right, and that's something that I've always been interested in as well. We're used to a certain ratio of height to width, whether we're talking about portraits, which we think of as vertical, or whether we're thinking of, quote, landscape, which we're thinking of horizontal. And this is off just a bit. It's not as wide, and we're kind of thrown by it a little bit because we may not even recognize why. Square paintings are problematic. I have a real thing for square paintings. I love them. I also love formats. It's called the format. I love formats that violate expectations. I love vertical landscape paintings. In fact, I do a lot of vertical landscape paintings intentionally. And we'll talk about why they're this way and how it affects you. But you're right, you picked up on something very real. And that is that this does violate in a very subconscious way our expectations. And what it does, you're right, is it makes you feel like something's been cut off, or sometimes that that the sides are pushing in. And we're going to see that in an early landscape painting that's vertical, and it feels wrong. It's uncomfortable because you feel like it's a bit claustrophobic when a landscape pushes in, because it's not supposed to. So we'll get to that. But I want to show some detail, because one of the things that Titian is doing is painting in now what we call a painterly style. We looked at linear painting before this. In other words, artists painted with tiny little brushes, and they basically painted small lines that kind of merged to create a smooth surface. But that's not what we're seeing now. Canvas has opened the door, I should say, to this new kind of painterly style where you're pushing the paint around, and you can also see, larger brushwork. Still not a lot. It's still not, we're a long way from thick paint, but nonetheless, it's a different way of painting. Now, this is the painting by Titian that was very intentionally meant to have sort of semi-erotic qualities. It's a private commission. It was commissioned by the Duke of Urbino. This is his wife. It was meant to hang in the private chambers. This was never meant to be on a museum walls or for anyone else to see. And it's interesting, the Venus of Urbino, calling her Venus is important. It's linking his new bride to this role of Venus. And remember, they're picking up on the Roman Venus, who is a goddess of not just of eroticism, but she's the goddess of the home and of marriage, and Venus has all these other sides to her in the Roman world, and certainly in the Renaissance world. And there's nothing at all sort of intellectual about it. We saw Venus in Florence being treated and compared even to the Virgin Mary. There was an intellectualization of Venus, in Botticelli's Primavera, where Venus is in the middle and being equated to the Virgin Mary. None of that sort of thing is going on in Venice. When they give you Venus, they're giving you a very frank scene of Venus. We're not pretending there's any religious metaphor here. It's just purely sensual image. Very, very typical of Venetian art. But this is very much about marriage. You see the servants in the background. She's getting into this chest in the background. It's a marriage chest. And the little dog at her feet, little dogs like that. Dogs always symbolize fidelity. We're going to see dogs in art more later. Dogs are, well, not always. Depends on how you see the dogs. But if you see dogs in a painting, how the dogs are behaving is important, because they're the symbol of how things are going in that scene. I mean, if dogs are lying there quietly at your feet, that's a good thing. I mean, they're the symbol of domesticity and fidelity. That's positive. If dogs are running around wild and tearing things up, that's a sign that there's something wrong in this household. The master's not looking after things properly. So depending, but generally they're a sign of fidelity, and generally they're positive. Cats have the opposite meaning, and we will also see cats in other paintings later. Now, first of all, the Duke married, this is Giulia Verano. He married her when she was 10 years old. She was considered a child bride. 4 years later, she reaches maturity at 14, and that's when she marries him. That's when they get married. So this is his 14-year-old bride. She is not considered a child bride at 14. She looks a bit older than that, but nonetheless, that's when it was painted, and that was, we know from paperwork and other things, that's her age. She is looking out sort of intentionally, alluringly. That's her job as the wife to do that. When we look at details, the textures are incredible. What Titian can do with texture, the softness of the, let's just close that door. Can we please just close the door? It's throwing too much light on the screen. Yeah, let's close it. I don't think there's that much air coming in that it's going to make that much difference. Thank you. That better?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. We've learned now. We won't open that. Yeah, because even from here, I guess it just looked washed out and you couldn't see. So now we can see the textures, the texture of the flesh, the flowers, the satiny quality of the sheets, the sort of brocade, and then that velvet. That's actually a deep green velvet curtain behind her. You can't really see the color very well, but that image has become archetypal, but this is where it begins. The image of the reclining female nude, which there are millions of in art, but this is where they begin. They begin right here in Venice. And they're metaphorically used for all sorts of different subjects, but this is where they begin. So, and I'll bring this back as well later, and we'll compare it to another work. So let's look at German Renaissance. Now, the Renaissance does make its way back up north and eventually up to the area we call Germany. I'm showing you the map because there was no Germany at this time. It was the Holy Roman Empire, Northern Europe, but it's the area that we call Germany, and they were speaking and writing German, even though there was no country called that. And I want to look at one of the more famous altarpieces. Northern Renaissance art, or I should say art in Northern Europe, or Renaissance art in Northern Europe, particularly in Germany, is a little more closely tied to medieval art. The Renaissance of Italy, many of the characteristics of Italian Renaissance don't make their way north for probably close to 100 years. So there are going to be more medievalisms in a German art, but I wanted to show you that one in situ painting so you could see what get a sense of its scale and see what it looks like. But now let's take a look at it. It's by Grunewald, who was the court painter of the Duke of Mainz in Germany. So he was a very important painter. And this altarpiece was painted specifically for the Abbey of St. Anthony and Isenheim. And the Abbey of St. Anthony specialized in medicine. It had a hospital of St. Anthony. And that's very important in understanding this altarpiece and its symbolism. This is the closed version. It splits down the middle and opens up, and we'll look inside. And then that splits down the middle again and opens again. So there are 3 layers, and the 3rd layer back is actually a group of sculpture. That's really how these altar panels started. The ones with wings, they originally had wings that closed to protect the sculpture inside. And then you open it and see the sculpture, and close it and you see the painting. So a really interesting style here that's new and yet old. First of all, I didn't put it on there, but this is oil, but it's oil on a wooden panel, the older style, not canvas yet in the north. It shows, of course, in the central section, the scene of the crucifixion, which we'll look at in more detail. The panel on the far left is Saint Sebastian, and on the far right is Saint Anthony. Both Sebastian and Anthony are what we call plague saints. They're associated with plagues, and I'll tell you why in just a second. And then the predella down below is a scene of the entombment of Christ, and we'll take a look at that as well. So Saint Sebastian, you can see the arrows stuck in him. He was shot full of arrows. Usually people say, you know, he was martyred by being shot with arrows. It's usually how he's depicted, but in reality, he wasn't. He was shot full of arrows, but he didn't die from that. He was healed and died later. Yes.
Can you pull him up close to it?
I can.
Okay.
Thank you. That is Saint Sebastian. Now, what's he got to do with plagues? Well, going all the way back to the Iliad, plagues have been associated with arrows. Homer in the Iliad references plagues falling randomly on people the way arrows fall randomly from the sky. Because plagues, when a plague would hit a community or a town, it's like this house would be hit and everybody die, and the one next door, nobody gets it. It seemed like random how a plague would affect people. And they equated that to the way when you just randomly shoot arrows in the sky, one guy gets hit and the next one doesn't, and the next one does. So it was this idea of plagues were like arrows falling from the sky. And that's how Sebastian got associated with plagues, because of the arrows and that link. Anthony has always been associated with plagues and diseases, because St. Anthony this is St. Anthony the Hermit, St. Anthony in the wilderness, St. Anthony who really founded the first monastery, but in the wilderness he was plagued by demons, and demons are depicted as little devils like diseases. So there's a connection between all the little demons that harassed St. Anthony, and again, illness. So that's how those two became plague saints, and St. Anthony in particular is associated with healing. So let's take a look at a detail now of the central panel. First of all, one of the things we notice right down there at the feet of Christ is an Agnus Dei, and we saw that in the Ghent altarpiece. Agnus Dei, the idea of the symbol of a sheep or a lamb who is bleeding into a cup or symbolizing Christ, that is an old medieval symbol. That's the sort of thing the Renaissance does away with, that sort of overt symbolism you do not see in Renaissance art. They simply remove all of that, they simplify it down. So the presence of that there in the crucifixion identifies it as kind of an old-fashioned style. It is early, it's 1510, but even then, it is sort of a late medieval style. It's very, very dark and very real. Okay, so the people, the characters are Mary, Mary, the mother of God, all in white, and then the young John, not John the Evangelist, John the Apostle, the young John, and then Mary Magdalene, and then this would be John the Baptist over here next to him. These are the figures, but let's take a look at the details of Christ. Now, we already saw one German work. Do you remember the Vesper build, the Pietà image carved out of wood? That was very realistic and very sort of aggressive and rough looking. That was very German, and I talked about how German art is the most realistic in the sense that it takes the reality of suffering. Only the Germans deal with the reality of the world at this time. You know, Italians would never touch anything like this. It's too horrific. But the Germans are going to deal with the reality of suffering. These are horrific images. And this would have been placed in the chapel in the hospital. You know, in the same way that hospitals today have chapels, have sort of non-denominational chapels in them, that's what this would have been, although everyone was Catholic, so you didn't have to worry about denominations. But nonetheless, it was a place where either people who were very ill would have been, or maybe their families or people visiting them would have used this chapel and would have seen this. This hospital in particular specialized in what was a very common problem in both the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and that was skin ailments. And so when we look at Christ, we see his body is covered in sores that really have nothing to do with the story of the crucifixion, but everything to do with where this altarpiece is placed. I mean, it's horrific. He has these blue lips and sores on his body. And first thought is, why are they doing this? These are people who are sick or their families are sick. You know, it seems almost sadistic to make them look at an image like this, but that is not how this is intended at all. This is intended as a positive and uplifting image, and let me tell you how. It's because it's a personalization of the general story of the crucifixion. The crucifixion is about, right, Christ dying for you, taking on your sins. Now, this is making it personal. He's literally taking on your illness, your condition. So it's an uplifting, it's meant to be a positive and uplifting message, not a horrifying, sadistic one. They would have seen this as a very personal message as he takes on your skin ailments. Now, here's how an Italian depicts the crucifixion, really quite differently. This is an early Raphael, but it's very Italian. The Italians would have never done that kind of horrific realism. It's an uplifting scene. It's a clear space, a bright sky, angels in the sky. You know, this has nothing to do with the reality of a man suffering, not at all. Very, very positive. That is the Italian version of it. When we look at the predella, it's also very individualized to this location. Those are two panels that actually slide out, and I'll show you what's behind it in a minute. but they divide right there. So we have the entombment of Christ, and people have pointed out the fact that this section that divides the two into two panels actually cuts his legs off right where they typically had to amputate the legs of many of the people suffering from these conditions. And so again, it's when you pull it apart, his legs are separating, right? So again, it's a very personalized take on the suffering of the people who are there. Now, when you open it up and it splits right down the middle and you swing the wings out, there are 3 scenes inside, and I'm not going to spend time on them. They're brilliant color because it's oil paint. I mean, this isn't tempera, so you can get these brilliant colors. We get the Annunciation on the far left, Mary with the angel choir, and then this incredible scene of the resurrection where this sunlight is just glowing. But they're Renaissance in that there's real spaces carved out. The tomb itself uses correct perspective. I mean, this person knows about some of the techniques that are invented in Italy. He's just working in the north and doesn't use them. When you see this splits right down the middle and swings out. And when you do that, you find the sculpture inside, which is done by another artist. This isn't Grunewald, it's a different artist, a sculptor. They're carved in wood. So it's St. Anthony and St. Jerome, I think. Yes, St. Jerome and St. Augustine. And then down here is another Last Supper, a scene with Christ in the middle, and then 4 groupings of 3. Yes.
Could you zoom in on that bottom part? That's interesting.
You see, they're painted. They're still, because it's been protected, the paint is still there, but they were richly painted. But yeah, it's very, he's used the same, mathematical model that Leonardo used in terms of how to group them. It is interesting. Let's see, do I have the sculptor's name? Nicholas of Hagenau. I don't know him. There would have been hundreds of sculptors like this at the time.
Peggy, can you zoom in on the right-hand wing? No, up. Yeah, right there.
Right there?
Yeah, I want to see the very far right, that whatever that is. Looks like there's a bunch of monsters in there. What's that all
Yes.
about?
This is St. Anthony in the wilderness, and these are demons harassing him, and they were equated with disease. You can see there's a little diseased demon right down here with sores all over his body. So this is how they thought of disease still. Again, the old medieval idea of disease, which were demons.
That looks like Hieronymus Bosch.
It does, very much so. He was also German. It's a very German point of view. So yes, it is very like Bosch, no question about it.
Wow, that's creepy.
And then you get over here again, St. Anthony is the hermit, I think, in St. Jerome, who didn't live at the same times, but I guess nobody worried about that. I'll just talk over him. Well, they got to do what they got to do. I mean, obviously we need that repaired. The most famous German artist of this period and the most influential is Albrecht Dürer. And I love Dürer. Who doesn't love Dürer? How could you not like Dürer? There's something wrong with you if you don't like the work of Albrecht Dürer. He's the greatest illustrator. He's the greatest technician in all of art. And he was in the right place to work that way because it's a very German style. Dürer sought all of his life to bring the Renaissance to the north. He visited Italy a number of times. His first trip to Italy was in 1495, and then he went back in 1505. And when he went to Italy, what he saw was Italian artists who were treated a lot better than the German. The German artists were still treated as craftsmen. They were still limited by guilds. They didn't get the respect, they didn't get the individuality that the Italians had. And he wanted that. He wanted to bring those ideas to Germany. And so that's what he set out for. That's his goal, his whole life, is to bring that sort of respect for the intellectual nature of art to the North. So when we see this wonderful self-portrait, another great portrait, a self-portrait, painted on wood, of course, in 1500, you can see there's writing there. That's his initials. He's the first one to create this little sort of insignia for himself, his letters, AD and the date. I mean, that's a powerful statement. You know, I'm an individual, here's my name. I'm not an anonymous craftsman. I'm going to put it right here on the front of the work of art. You know, most artists didn't even sign the back of a work of art. Most works of art aren't signed. Signing art is a new thing, and certainly never putting it on the front. That's totally modern. But to put his initials on the front is a powerful personal statement. It was seen as obviously very egotistical, but that was the idea. I'm here. And then he writes over here, if for some reason you missed the message, he says, I, Albrecht Dürer of Nuremberg, painted myself thus with undying colors at the age of 28 years. So I made this, I was only 28, look at these colors, look at what I can do, and I'm gonna write it right here on the surface. And that's the great thing about a self-portrait, is you are your own patron, you can do whatever you want. There's nobody telling you how to do it or what to do. Now, most people aren't missing the fact that this is a very Christ-like image. That's very intentional. In fact, it was not just him. It's not uncommon at the time. It was a very powerful and popular religious practice to emulate Christ. That's what you were supposed to do, is emulate Christ. He's just doing it very physically with the long hair, with the gesture. He's holding his hand, his right hand is in a gesture of blessing, the way a priest would give a blessing. You know, he's basically saying, you know, in my world, I'm the God. You know, in the big world, you know, that's a very Renaissance ideal in general. You know, God was in charge of everything else, but on earth, man is that. Man is to the earth what God is to the cosmos. And so he's making those parallels, showing himself that way, identifying. Artists create. That's another thing, that idea that artists create. You know, in the Middle Ages, artists made things. In the Renaissance, they create. Yes?
Do we know how different he was from this tradition?
He looks similar to that, but he's accentuating the Christ-like qualities, particularly in the hand gesture, giving a blessing. The long hair. He probably, I honestly don't know how long his hair was, but we know that he's emphasizing, particularly in giving a blessing, is the most important thing to emulate Christ. And that idea of referring to themselves as creators, you know, creating was something only God did. Artists made things, God created. Now artists create. And that's a powerful change. That's an important difference. So he wanted artists to be seen as intellectuals, and particularly participants in this humanistic tradition. That's what artists were in Italy. They were intellectuals, and they participated in humanism, this whole program of humanism, and they were creators of ideas. I love comparisons. As you know, this is an interesting one. They're very similar in a lot of ways. They're both making statements. Of course, one's a self-portrait and one's not, but they're both making important statements about who this person is. And you can read those, you know, that dark background of Dürer. German paintings tend to be somewhat darker anyway, but the dark background that just focuses on this light, where Raphael is sort of softening the scene with that warm color. This is also a good time to talk about printmaking, because Dürer really is one of the artists to bring prints into the realm of fine art. Now, I would say the majority of people in this world don't know what a print is. It's a word that is used a lot, but it's used incorrectly most of the time. People refer to any sort of image as a print when it's usually a poster or something like that. A print is an original work of art. It's just made in multiple versions. Now, these photo reproduced images are not prints, although we tend to call them that in popular culture. But just so we understand, we're talking about fine art prints, not popular prints that you can buy at the Nelson Gallery of a reproduction of a work of art. That's not a print. That's a photo reproduction. These are actual prints, and they're unique. And prints have been around. They were often used in folk art in the Middle Ages. They were sort of folk images, especially woodcuts. And they continue to be part of folk art, but with Dürer, they begin to move into the realm of fine art. And from here on, prints move into fine art. There are a couple of different kinds, and Dürer worked in two different kinds. He did work in relief printing. Relief prints and the woodcut or the lino cut are the most common types of relief prints. A relief print is when the raised area of the matrix is inked and printed. Now, let me explain. The matrix is some sort of material that is carved or cut in some way so that there are elevated and recessed areas. And in a woodcut, it's wood. You just got the wooden block and you carve out. And then what you do once you've carved away, you ink the top, the surface that is raised, because it's a relief print. You ink it, and then when you lay a piece of paper on it, and a roller over it and lift it off, you're going to get an ink reproduction in reverse of whatever you carved. You know, if you've ever like made a potato print in kindergarten or whatever, that's a relief print. Relief printing, while Dürer experimented with a bit, it falls out of use. It really never caught on in fine art until the 20th century. There's a huge resurgence of popularity of woodcuts in the 20th century. We'll deal with that later, but he's just experimenting with it here. And because you can ink it again and another sheet of paper and then ink it again and another sheet, you can have multiples of the same image, but every one of them is considered an original work of art. It's just not unique. Now, why does Dürer like prints? Well, prints, number one, are cheaper to sell. It's just paper. A lot of people can afford to buy a print who can't afford to go out and commission an oil painting. And what that means is he can spread his fame wildly. He can become known. He just made hundreds and hundreds of prints and sold them very, very cheap and became very, very famous. It's a way to get your name out. He wanted to be known. You know, he's out there seeking fame and acknowledgement, just like all the Renaissance artists were, and prints are a good way to do that. He also, and here's his most famous woodcut, the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. This was really popular. He distributed this quite widely and made quite a lot of money off of it when you sell a lot of them, but it made his name, it made him very famous. So there's the Four Horsemen. Starting at the right, actually, is a conquest, war, famine, and then death down below. So that's his first and most famous woodcut. You can see woodcuts don't use paint, they're just ink. So it's going to be black and white. It's the white of the paper, the black of the ink. There's no color there. The more widespread technique are intaglio prints. And intaglio just means cut in Italian, intaglio. And there are several different types of intaglio. The earliest that Dürer worked in is an engraving. And in intaglio prints, unlike a relief print where the raised portion is inked, in an intaglio, it's the recessed area that is inked. In a woodcut, you have to think backwards. Woodcuts are tricky because what you cut is actually the negative space. Your cut is the background. It's the opposite as of drawing. Like when you have a pen in your hand and you make a mark, that pen, that's the dark mark, right? But with a woodcut, your mark is the white area on either side of the mark, And what you leave raised is the dark line. So you're thinking backwards. That's why most people didn't cut their own wood blocks. Durer would do a drawing and then hire a professional wood carver to actually carve the block. However, he did cut his own engravings because they're not counterintuitive. The cut you make in a woodcut, in an engraving, is the same as the pen mark you would make. So you don't have to think backwards in cutting one. They're made using a copper plate and a sharp tool, and usually straight lines. And when you make straight lines, those are called hatching lines. And then when you cross those lines, those are called cross hatching. And the closer you put those lines, the darker the shadow will be. It creates the illusion of a darker color. You can create the illusion of different grays, even though there's no gray on the paper. It's black or it's white, but depending on how close the lines are together, your mind will merge them and see gray. And we'll see that in a painting, in an engraving in a minute. Here's his most famous engraving of Adam and Eve. Now, when you look at the figures of Adam and Eve, you see a range of grayscale. It looks like they're modeled in gray. They are not. There's nothing there but black ink and white paper. But because he puts the lines very close together, it creates the illusion of grayscale. Now, this is an interesting piece, because it is a metaphor of medicine, of the humors. Anybody familiar with the Renaissance conception of the humors in the body, Renaissance medicine? They believe that there are 4 fluids in the body that determine your personality, that determine who you are. It's black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. These are the 4 humors, and that and those also define your medical condition. So if you're sick or there's something wrong with you, it's because you have an excess of one of those 4 fluids. Now, if you're running a fever, that's believed to be an excess of blood, which is why they would drain you, why they would cut you and drain blood from the body. We all know they did that, but this is why, because you had an imbalance of the humors, and to balance that, you had too much blood, so they had to remove blood. That's the logic for it. Now, that's Renaissance science. Now, that's better science than the Middle Ages, because they no longer think that disease comes from a bunch of little demons that have inhabited you. They're scientific now. They know that demons aren't causing disease. It's really these 4 fluids in your body that you have excesses of. I mean, to us, it's just as bad, but it's very scientific compared to the little demons that cause disease. I mean, it is a step forward, just as likely to kill you, probably, but nonetheless, it is somewhat scientific. And there are symbols of the different humors here as well. Black bile, which actually was associated with melancholy. If you have too much black bile, these are in the liver. The biles were in the liver. Black bile and yellow bile were seen as in the liver. And that if you're a melancholic person, everyone was seen as having one of these 4 personality types. And if you're melancholic, subject to despair, that's because you have too much black bile. And that was symbolized by the elk. So that elk there symbolizes black bile. Yellow bile is what's called a choleric temperament. If you're prideful and angry and sort of jealous, then you have an excess of yellow bile, and that is symbolized by the cat, the very famous choleric cat down here. Phlegm, if you're lethargic and an apathetic person, then you have an excess of phlegm, and that's associated with the ox, which you see lying down back there, and blood. If you're too optimistic and like the pleasures of the flesh a little too much, or if you are prone to fevers, then you have an excess of blood, and that's symbolized by the little rabbit down there on the ground. The parrot that you see on top of the sign symbolizes false wisdom, because parrots only, I love this association with parrots and false wisdom, because parrots only repeat what they've heard. So that's seen as false wisdom. You're just repeating what you heard. So that's a symbol of that. And then the little sign there actually just says, Durer made this, or Durer made me, and it has the date of 1504. So that's sort of Adam and Eve. So from here on, prints and printmaking will be a part of the fine art world. And there are a number of artists who will move this medium along. In the 17th century, Rembrandt is going to be an important printmaker who really develop and expand on another kind of intaglio print, but prints are very important for Durer. Here's a detail of a woodcut and an engraving. You can see the difference. Woodcuts, wood is a softer material. It's hard to get a lot of really tiny, precise detail in wood because of that. So it tends to be bigger, sort of a cruder style, where engraving, because you're cutting tiny little lines on a copper plate, you can get much more finer detail, and that is what became more popular and really stayed in the fine art world. You can see these ranges of grayscale, but all they are straight lines that are closer together or farther apart. It's just how much of the white paper are you allowing through the lines. Okay.
Excuse me. Back up, the self-portrait of Durer, when I saw that face, I was trying to think of a famous one. And I think it's the Leonardo da Vinci Salvator Mundi one. That's so controversial. It was.
Yeah, I saw a documentary on that, right?
And it's in somewhere in one of the Gulf countries now, owned by.
Right. I haven't seen that in a while, but I should watch that again.
So it was done between 1499 and 1510, so it goes right along. I mean, they wouldn't have been, would they been contemporaries?
Yeah, but there's no, I don't know that he ever, I mean, they lived at the same time.
Yeah.
It's theoretically possible he could have seen it, but that is a self-portrait.
And straight on, frontal.
Right, that's done. They both, a lot of people are going to do that when they want to confront you. I'm glad you brought that up. That is a confrontational pose. When you want to confront someone, you look them straight on and straight in the eye. It's called confrontational. It's an aggressive way of showing someone. So they both wanted to confront somebody. It's confrontational, meaning he forces the viewer to deal with something. It's aggressive. People aren't used to that, aren't used to someone looking. People in pictures aren't supposed to know they're being looked at, right? There's a voyeuristic quality to looking at art. You're outside peeking into someone's world. And they're not supposed to make you uncomfortable by looking back at you. And so when someone looks you in the eye, it's uncomfortable. So he might have seen that, but he would have made that anyway. I mean, this is his confrontational view by sort of forcing you to confront it. Yeah.
You said Durer went to Italy.
He was in Italy.
But then did he go back to Germany and?
Yeah, and then he went back to
and-
Germany.
And that was where his career was.
He made one trip before 1500. So yeah, he worked totally in Nuremberg. But
This Salvatore Mundi picture,
right,
it's full frontal, it doesn't have that. What you're explaining.
Right.
This one.
Yeah.
It's almost challenging, but Mundi's isn't,
yeah,
even though it's frontal.
yeah. I mean, there are a million pictures that I don't really see any reason to assume he would have seen that or known that. Because that's just how mostly they were painted. What is unique here is that straight in your eye. And this was obvious to anyone who saw this, had never seen anything quite like it before. And it was seen as very aggressive. Okay, let's talk about the 16th century. There are some centuries that are important in terms of the changes that they reflect. And the 16th century is one of them. You know, one of the things we're going to talk about when we get to the modern era is the idea of change and how things change and the speed at which things change. Now, we take change for granted today, that things are going to be different very soon. And we begin noticing these things in 16th century, 17th, 18th in particular. We'll talk about that. Prior to that, change happened so slowly that people didn't think about it that much. Most centuries ended pretty much the same way they began. Things didn't change within any one person's lifetime so much that they would notice it dramatically. But the 16th century is unique. And a lot of things changes. Now, by 1520s, the high Renaissance in Italy is dead. And there's still a whole lot of century left. So what happens in the rest of that century? That's what we're going to talk about right now. And that is an important time for a number of reasons. So let's see what happens. The single most important thing that sparks these dramatic changes are the Protestant Reformation. 1517. Now, that doesn't mean the turmoil begins in 1517. It started long before then. It's in fact the culmination of a lot of turmoil within the church that Martin Luther just takes under, his own control and makes this break with the church in 1517. And things begin to change rapidly after that. So Martin Luther, 1517, marking the beginning of what'll be a tumultuous century. 1527, Rome is sacked by the troops of the Holy Roman Empire. Rome is at war a lot during this period. The High Renaissance is over by this time. Leonardo is gone. Actually, he's dead by this time, but he left for France, early, much earlier than this. Raphael is dead by this time. Michelangelo, as we're going to see, is one of the few artist painters remaining in Rome, and he's working in a very different way after this period. So things are changing. The Catholic Church is becoming aware of it. As early as the 1530s, they're beginning reforms. The church is having problems, and they need to find a way to deal with it. And one of the things they do is the Pope affirms this new order within the church known as the Society of Jesus, also known as the Jesuits. And the Jesuits become really the leaders. They're the leaders of these reform movements in the 16th century under the leadership of Ignatius of Loyola, who later became Saint Ignatius. He had written a book, a small series of texts or treatises in the 1520s, and the spiritual exercises are going to be very influential, not only on reforms in the church, but on art very directly, as we will see. So the Jesuits are in power. 1542, the Holy Order of the Inquisition begins to crack down on heretics. What the church does when their belief system is challenged and people are pulling away is basically they double down on orthodoxy. They begin to be stricter on it. They begin to really hunt out the heretics and crack down on heresy. So that begins. And then by 1545, we have the Council of Trent. The Council of Trent is one of those historical events that everyone should know of. The Council of Trent is a series of meetings in Italy, in different cities. I think the first meetings were in Trento, so it's always called the Council of Trent, but they met in different Italian cities under the leadership of Ignatius and the Jesuits. And their purpose was to initiate reforms and crack down, and particularly to reaffirm very strongly, number one, the power of the Pope, the importance of the Mass, the importance of the Holy Sacraments, and the veneration of saints. And these are the four principal things that the Protestants are protesting against and rejecting. So the church is coming back and demanding change. And they're demanding change not only in church reform, but also in the arts. In fact, Ignatius speaks directly about the role of the arts and calls for changes. What he calls for is a new kind of emotional religious art. One of the things he says that was a problem was this over intellectualization in art, in religious art. Also, independent thinking was a big problem that led people to where the Protestant Reformation came from. And humanism is a bit of a problem. So let's crack down on these. He called for an emotional art, and particularly the idea of personal participation. And he talks about this as early as the 20s in the spiritual exercises. In other words, he says, if you're thinking about, say, the nativity or the crucifixion, he says, I want you to imagine that you were there. I want you to think about what it would have been like. What do you hear? What do you smell? Engage your senses if you're at this place. What does it feel like? So it's trying to get you to have a very, very personal experience with this. It's more reminiscent in some ways with an older medieval sort of meditation, in the Middle Ages, when they would meditate on icons in order to imagine themselves sort of transported. You get a lot of mystical writers coming out of this period. The mystics are reborn, and people start having visions like crazy, and mystics start writing about these experiences. People who have visions that they were at the crucifixion, and here's what I saw, and here's what, and that comes right out of Ignatius's writings, telling people to do that. Now, how's that going to affect art if you're a painter? Well, it actually applies very well to something like painting. This whole idea of an emotional, personal, sensual experience is going to play into art, as we will see very shortly. I want to show you the mother church of the Jesuit order, which was built during this time in Rome. It's the Church of Il Gesù. This new style that I'm talking about that comes out of the Counter-Reformation, and the Counter-Reformation is just that. It's a movement that is meant to counter the Reformation. So it's a Catholic movement that's designed to bring people back or keep people in the church. And it's called Mannerism, is the style of architecture and art. And the first church that just beginning to show these new qualities of emotion and drama that will really peak in the next century is the Church of Il Gesù. And Il Gesù just means Jesus. And it's the mother church of the Society of Jesus, or i.e. the Jesuits. Now we've looked at, I find it such an interesting comparison to look at it next to a Renaissance church of Santa Maria Novella in Rome, and then now Il Gesù, like 100 years later. And while they're very similar, it's amazing similarities, there are some striking differences. The Renaissance church, the surface is, first of all, very flat and inscribed by all this geometry. And we talked about the geometry in Renaissance art and how symbolic that was of sort of the order of the cosmos, and even symbolic of the presence of God in that sense of order, but all very flat and very intellectual. And what we see in Il Gesù is the surface is beginning to be animated. All of these ornamentations, and ornamentations on architecture means anything that's attached to the surface. Like if you stick columns on the front or anything you add to the surface that's not really structural, it's just added, those are called ornaments. And now all these ornamentations, like these columns and finials and scrolls, they're all now rising off the surface. They're becoming three-dimensional. They're becoming alive. It's a more dynamic surface. And the reason it's more dynamic and more dramatic is because the deeper the surface of a building, the greater the contrast of light and dark, right? And the greater the contrast of light and dark, the more dramatic. You know, shadow and highlight, that's drama. So the more drama you can create, the more intense it is. So it's a small change here, but it's going to be much greater by the time we get to the next century. So mannerism is beginning, and here's the plan of the church. It's still recognizable. We still have the nave. There's somewhat of a transept identified, but it's very different inside. It's much more open. And the reason for that is this is actually a congregational church. This isn't just about where the mass is performed. This is where people congregate in large numbers to hear sermons, to hear someone talk. Ignatius was a brilliant speaker, and he gave sermons here that brought crowds of people. So it's open. It's a big open space. It's not a narrow nave for people to just walk down. I'll show you the inside. This is the apse. It's a huge open apse area and a huge congregational area. And I just want to show you this painting. We'll look at this artist later. It's a 17th century painting. Anybody want to guess who the artist is?
Mm.
No, not really. But that was a good guess, right? No, it's not. It's Rubens, but we're going to look at Rubens a little later when we get to the 17th century. But I wanted to show it because he's painting a picture of Ignatius giving a sermon in El Jesu. And if he's doing this 100 years later, it's not really like 50 years later, then it tells you these were famous. This wasn't happening in his lifetime. It had happened earlier, but everybody knew about it. So this is now passion. This is not an intellectual religion. This is a passionate religion. People are fainting because of the words. I mean, the drama of what he's talking about, the emotion of what he's talking about couldn't be further from a Renaissance religious experience. It simply isn't. And it's very much, you can almost hear. It was also a time where there's a great revival of the interest of music in churches. His music is drama and passion as well. So you can imagine the interior filled with music and the, you know, passionate teachings of someone like Ignatius, of people, you know, literally fainting, a bit dramatic, but then, you know, it was painted in the 17th century. So this is the direction we're moving. In terms of Mannerist painting, however, the biggest influence on that is the work of Michelangelo. Now, he's the last of the high Renaissance artists still in Rome, but he's working now in a very different style. You know, we looked at the ceiling. That was done in 1508 to 12. And even in the ceiling, he was ahead of time. You know, when we looked at the, you know, creation of Adam, we talked about how that composition of that was not really very Renaissance. It was all diagonals and it was a lot of movement and the like. But now by the time he comes back 30 years later to paint the back wall, he's working now in a totally different style, and it really is influential to these new Mannerists. It's a scene of the Last Judgment, a subject we haven't seen since the Middle Ages, since the high medieval world, and we saw this Romanesque tympanum from Autun, where we saw the Last Judgment and, you know, hell and, you know, all the drama of high medieval art. That's back. You know, that connection to the Middle Ages is a very strong one in terms of its attachment to the spirituality and the drama of religion. The fact that he's reviving this subject so foreign to a Renaissance sensibility really speaks to this moment in time and the turmoil of the century. You know, Michelangelo himself was going through his own personal spiritual crisis, as I think many people were in the 16th century. And that plays out very much in this scene where instead of having, you know, the damned on one side and the saved on the other, the way we had in that medieval tympanum, here we have sort of heaven and the saved are above and hell is the down below, but we do have them separated. And I think I do have some details to look at, but we can just sort of look at some of the areas. There are, hundreds of figures here. It's hard to see all of them. We see not God the Father, but Christ here in the center, wielding justice. Most of these figures up here around him are martyrs, martyred saints, and some of them have identified, like this is Saint Catherine with the wheel that she was martyred on. Yes, that's meant to be a female body. Look at that. Look at those arms. Yeah, that's Michelangelo doing his thing again. And then down here, we've got angels, people being judged, and then down below is hell itself. So look at some of the details here. Here's Christ. Now, one of the things we see in Mannerist art is this return to a kind of exaggerated figures and proportions, like we saw in the Middle Ages, right? Figures weren't realistically proportioned. Figures are exaggerated, they're drawn out. It's for drama and emotion. You want something emotional, you draw it out. Things like this, where the legs don't seem to fit the torso, the head seems to be a bit small for the body. It's exaggerated. Now, he always did that a little bit anyway, but he's doing that more. Mary in this strange, exaggerated pose, elongated pose. Figures like this, where the head doesn't seem to sit exactly right on the body. It seems to be, number one, too small. That head should be much bigger than that. If it's closer to you, this is mannerism beginning. One of everybody's favorite figures over here, this guy, this is Saint Bartholomew. But Saint Bartholomew was martyred by being flayed alive, where your skin is cut off of you. And he's holding the flaying knife. And I always say this, as some of you have heard me say this before, that I think it's appalling that there is a specialized knife that was made just for the purpose of cutting someone's skin off of them while they are alive, and there was. And I'm not sure whether that's worse than the flaying itself, that it happens so often that you had a specialized knife. However, that's why he's holding the skin that symbolizes his skin. The problem is, when you look at the face here and his face, that's not his face. That is the face of Michelangelo. He put his face on the skin of Saint Bartholomew. Now, the next question is an obvious one. Why would he do that? What is he thinking? What's happening in his mind that he is identifying with this martyred saint? And that's usually seen as being related to his own personal spiritual crisis, that he's identifying so closely with someone like that. Yeah, it's a powerful message. People also, or my 18 to 20-year-old students always wanted to know about things like drapery painted here to cover him up. Some of the figures have exposed genitalia, some of them it's covered. The reason for that is, after his death, the people in the church officials, were unhappy with the nudity in this. So it's right after his death. So it's not like a long time later, it's in the same century, and they hired other artists to come in and paint drapery, in strategic places that cover up the genitals. So when they were doing the cleaning, they had to decide, do we leave these or do we remove these? So their decision was, let's remove some of them and leave some of them. So that's what they did. So, half of the figures, the drapery has been removed because it wasn't original to Michelangelo. And some of it is left because these were other artists whose work you would be destroying if you remove them all. So I think that was probably a good compromise. Remove some to the original and leave some to its secondary stance. What I love more than anything is down here in hell. Because number one, you get a river and the boat. Okay, what you're getting is now a classical conception. This is now the underworld, and look, this is the river Styx. We're going back to Greco-Roman mythology to define a Christian hell. Minos, King Minos from the island of Crete, who did in Greek mythology, does become one of the judges in the underworld. So he puts Minos in the underworld. One of my favorite areas, let me see if I can, of the painting is, look right down here. There's like a little cave that goes back into the dark. And then over here, there's another cave sort of behind. It's like Tartarus in the underworld. Remember Tartarus, which was the deep, dark hole in the Greek underworld? You had the underworld, and then you had the really bad place, which was Tartarus, which was often depicted as a cave. So we're getting that in this Christian conception of hell, but it's, you know, rich colors, and look how he's creating this illusion of depth with these sort of demon-like figures back here that look like they're way, way back in the distance on this flat surface. So a very, very important wall that does influence Mannerists such as Pontormo. Now, we know that Raphael and Michelangelo, Leonardo, these high Renaissance artists were eventually considered sort of geniuses. They were considered great, brilliant artists in their own lifetimes. So now you're the next generation coming along. How do you deal with that? How do you get better? You know, how are you going to compete with the great Raphael, or particularly the great Raphael? Because that's, when they thought of the great artist, Raphael was the number one artist they thought of. How are you going to compete? Well, maybe it's best if you don't try to compete. You react against them in a way. And the dialogue within the church, the sort of anti-classical sensibility in some ways within the church, I'm not just saying anti-classical, I must say anti-intellectual nature within the church, gave you some justification for doing that. And for some Mannerist artists, a kind of anti-classicism is a part of the style they develop. So anti-classical design is chosen for its emotional intensity and its instability as well. There's no question about that. They're almost like hallucinatory. This is a scene of the deposition. The deposition is a term that refers to when Christ is taken down from the cross. It's called the deposition. He's being deposed from the cross. Now, that's almost always paired with a scene of the Annunciation. In fact, this is one half of two paintings. Originally, there were two paintings side by side, the Annunciation and the Deposition. They were paired because it was sort of like the beginning and the end of Christ, sort of when he incarnates, takes human form in the womb of Mary at the Annunciation, and then when he's taken down from the cross. So this is just, they're called pendant pieces, and pendant pieces can refer to any two works of art that are individual works, but they're meant to be kept together, like portraits of a husband and wife, for example, or other scenes that are meant to be together. And typically those two are together. Now, when we look at this, it's a fairly disturbing image. It's nothing like we've seen before. It's this swirling mix. It's anything but the clear symmetrical designs we're used to in Renaissance art. It's very hard to even see what's going on. In fact, there's not even a cross visible. How do you even know what's happening here? Let's take a look at some of it. The space is very difficult to read. The space is very compressed. You have a whole lot of people pushed into a very shallow space. This is very typical of Mannerist painting. The proportions are odd when you look at a figure like this. The colors are very unusual, sort of pink person with this head that doesn't seem to attach properly to that body. This figure is very elongated. A lot of the figures seem sort of boneless. The body of Christ is sort of twisted in strange ways. I love this pink.
I don't think he could draw very well.
No, this is a choice. He could draw just fine. This is a choice. It's a style, intentionally distorting the forms for intensity. It's meant to be not a real thing in the real world. We're going back to the medieval conception of the reality of the spiritual. This is meant to be a hallucinatory vision where things are swirling all around you and you don't know what's real and what's not real. That's a very important part of it. It's meant to be dramatic and emotional in the same way that the distortions of medieval art were emotional. This is how you speak to the emotion, not the intellect. This isn't meant to be something you think about. This is meant to be something you feel about, even if that feeling is disturbing. It's meant to disturb you. Absolutely, it's meant to disturb you. One of the qualities of Mannerist art, when you're in front of a big Mannerist painting, is you always feel like the figures are about to fall out on you. You know, you want to take a couple steps back. I always call it the crowded elevator space, because we always had that problem in our building. Certain times of the day, when students are coming in and out of classes, that elevator door opens, it's like packed, and like, do I want to step in there or not? It looks like they're going to fall out on you. That crowded elevator space that makes everybody uncomfortable, that's what these are, and that's what they're meant to be. Here's a detail again where you can see the unusual nature of the colors. That's why it's called mannered. You know, he's not trying to compete with Raphael. It's meant to be unstable, disturbing. It's meant to create a mood and have this kind of emotional intensity. That's mannered art. When you compare it to, say, a Raphael high Renaissance subject, you know, there's a clarity to Raphael, even though there's a lot of people and there's a certain amount of movement because he has some dramatic diagonals. There's also a clarity there. You can see back in space, the light evenly identifies everyone. You can see them clearly. You know where they are in space in relation to one another. The colors are more simple, primary colors. It's similar and yet it's different and preferred. But it's Mannerist portrait, I think, where Mannerism really shines. I love Mannerist portraits. Some of them are really bizarre, but this is another beautiful portrait. This is the portrait of Eleonora of Toledo and her son Giovanni de' Medici. She's the wife of Cosimo de' Medici. This is a very important woman and a very important son and a very important painting. Because of that, Bronzino was the official portrait painter of the Medici, one of them anyway. It's painted now on wood. The Mannerist painters like to go back to painting oil on wood, and they like to go back to that linear style. This is not a Venetian style of oil painting. It's an older style. Let's look some detail of her dress. Look at this. Is this incredible? See, brush strokes, not a one. He's using tiny little 1 or 2 hair brushes so that there's nothing visible there. It's absolutely stunning. Of course, this is like one of the most important women in the world. I mean, this is obviously a very important painting, so it's going to be done. Let's look at some other details here. I got her face coming up. Let's look at the garment of the child of Giovanni. It's this, I don't know what this is, but it's kind of a strange reflective fabric. You can see the brocade, the details of the brocade, the pearls, but look at her fingers. Mannerist portraits are often referred to as the figures are boneless. It's like they curve in ways that fingers can't curve. I mean, there's no bones in there describing them. When we look at it in full, look at her arm. Look at the length of this arm. That arm is really long. I mean, it's way too long, but it's elegant. The elegance is more important. What's actually more important is the telling of dynastic power and succession. This isn't about personality. This is about, who is this person? She is aloof, haughty, very formal, very straight, very elegant. Again, of course, she is the wife of one of the most important and powerful men in Florence at the time. The child, Giovanni, was actually on a fast track from when he was born. He was being groomed to be the Pope. He was going to be the next Pope. Every family wanted popes. The Medici had several popes in the family, as did the Farneses and all the other wealthy families. But this little boy was supposed to be a Pope. He didn't live long enough. He died before of malaria, I think the same year his mother died, but he was going far. He made cardinal at the age of 17. He was a 17-year-old cardinal. But he didn't live long enough to be Pope, but Giovanni did live quite a while. Nonetheless, yeah, here's those details, and here's her face. I love this face, these smoothness of the surface. Look at the emphasis on her forehead. You know how much forehead there is. I don't know that her head is shaved. This is most likely the artist taking liberties and just extending her forehead. Yeah.
Peggy, I think proportionally, I'm looking at that, it's a gorgeous portrait, but her head is too small for her whole torso. The torso and the arm
Long,
are
too long.
better than the head is too small.
Yeah, typically the heads are too small
Uh-huh.
in Mannerist paintings, and it's sort of just an elegance. This is about
That's a gorgeous portrait.
elegance. And what I also love is that blue background. Look at that blue. That's just like electric. Bronzino uses that in several paintings, and it's just energizing.
And that, the little boy is just alive. His face is gorgeous.
Well, this is all about line of succession. This is political. This is 100% political. Here's my wife, here's my son, here's my line of succession. And you see that when you compare it to something like, again, the Raphael, which was all about personality and subtle communication of values. And now so is the Bronzino. It's just that the values are different. The values are political now, and they're all about establishing that dynastic power and the succession within the Medici family. Couldn't be more different, but they both beautifully speak about a moment in time and an individual. They just want to say different things about those people. And this is the one we have in the Nelson, a beautiful portrait, which is in that room that has all the ceramics in it when you come out of the sort of Renaissance room, and then the next room you come into. People don't see this a lot. It's not in a place where it's seen by a lot of people.
Your hands are the same way here.
Yeah, the same elegant fingers. It's elegance is everything, and it's about showing yourself as a sophisticated, elegant person. So it's very much how he wants to be seen. Portrait of a young man. We don't know who it is. He has.
I think you can always tell Mannerist paintings by the hand.
Yeah, the hands are a dead giveaway. The proportions, the fact that they're very linear, they're painted on wood, you can recognize them as opposed to anybody else. Right. Well, they're always information. Like sometimes they're holding a book. They're often holding a book, which is meant to say, look, I'm a sophisticated person. Yeah, I'm holding a book. In this case, that is the hilt of a sword that he's holding. So those are there for a statement. They're not natural. They're very artificial. There's an artificiality to Mannerist art in general, but the portraits are very artificial and haughty. But those were the values of that moment in time.
The collar.
Yeah, I noticed that too.
It looks like it's embroidered or.
Yeah,
Detail on that collar.
and there's the little threads right
Yeah,
here.
right.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And this is sort of like, it's probably a velvety texture. It's hard to see for sure what kind of texture he's going for. But look at that elongated face. Look at the hands on the sword hilt. Just beautifully elegant. Important statements. So that's a lovely Bronzino.
Peggy,
Yes.
I have a question about something you said earlier. I went back to when you were talking about that Mannerist architecture and you showed that church
Uh-huh.
that was, so you said, and you were talking about, the church having that Council of Trent, and you said something about people sitting in church, and that this is what I want to ask. So I remember I've kind of heard, growing up Catholic, that at a certain point in time, people mostly just like had services like in their house and things like that. And the thing that always strikes me as funny when you go to Europe are all of those churches, like, well, a lot of the ones I saw from the medieval period, they had pews and things like that, but a lot of them don't have anything. They're just big empty spaces. And
Well,
they
they
might
had
just have,
chairs.
they
moved.
might have chairs, right? And my question is, did, was there a point when people really didn't utilize the church as a place to go to service or worship, or?
No, churches were always, it's where the mass was held, but you went for the mass, you went for the ritual.
Uh-huh.
Generally, you didn't go for a sermon. You
Oh.
went for the ritual of the mass and the sacraments, performance of the sacraments and the Eucharist. That's in the Catholic Church, that's primarily what it was for. And like you said, people generally stood at that time. Today they bring in chairs and they'll fill them up, but they don't have built-in pews. You're right.
Right.
Some of them are just big empty spaces. Because people just mostly stood for the ceremonies. The idea of services in your home, no, that's not a Catholic. No, that's Protestant. Some Protestant groups might do that, like Quakers and Amish and the like, but no, churches were always there for ritual.
So they really didn't, people just went and stood then, they didn't really have.
Yeah,
Okay, all right, thanks.
they would stand. It wouldn't, the mass wasn't that long. It wasn't like a long time.
Uh-huh.
They would often have masses just continuously throughout a day, and you just drop in and
Okay.
get your Eucharist and your wine and go home. I mean, they weren't like long sermons.
No homily.
Yeah. But that changes over time. Okay, I think one more, my last comparison. I love looking at these two guys because they're so similar and so different in a lot of ways. Anyway, does anybody have any questions or comments? Right, one is just there, they're just hands, and the other one you're really meant to look at. I mean, one is drawing your attention and the other one is really not. You're supposed to look at the face. Here in the Mannerist, you're supposed to see all the little details.
And the colors are more real on the Raphael.
Yeah, I think so. Well, the Raphael is, yeah, you're right. Well, actually, let me just do this one last one really quickly, and then we can, because we'll start the Baroque next time. The last Mannerist piece I want to look at is just the Last Supper. It's just how a Mannerist interprets the Last Supper, Tintoretto's version of the Last Supper, as opposed to Leonardo's. In Tintoretto's, you're hard pressed to see it as like even the same event. It's like a totally different event that's happening here. He's placing it. And this is where, we have to look at, well, what is he doing that is creating this very different mood than Leonardo? Well, he's put the table at a diagonal, and there's nothing more dramatic than a diagonal that goes back into this dark space, creating a lot of contrast and drama. He's giving us two light sources, one real and one spiritual. He's brought in all these other people who are running around doing all these things. This is a loud moment. It's an active moment. It's dynamic, and it's very spiritual, because we're seeing angels and things up here in the sky. He's removing it from the mundane of the real world and putting it back in that spiritual, like they did in the Middle Ages. And when you compare them, you're really just seeing two different religious conceptions of man's relationship to God. And Leonardo's giving us an ordered world that is measurable and clear. And in his time, that was the sign of the presence of God. And Tintoretto, 100 years later, almost exactly 100 years later, is telling us, no, that's not how the world works. It's a dramatic and emotional world, and it's not tied to physicality. It's not measurable. That's a very medieval idea. It's like the church going back to the time when it was the dominant institution and reestablishing that authority. It seems like that's what they're trying to do. Like with the Renaissance, they lost a bit of control. Humanism opened up the church, and now they're trying to go back and lock those doors back down again and get that power back again. And it doesn't really work because Protestantism doesn't stop. It just keeps growing and growing. And we'll talk about that because next time we're going to talk about the 17th century and the growth of Protestantism and the Catholic reaction and the Baroque. Is the 17th century is one of the most interesting periods. It's a very important transitional century as well. So that's what we'll do next week, is begin looking at the art of the Baroque, which tends to be most people's favorite periods. Okay. Okay, see you next week. Bye, everybody.